Hey everyone, thank you for joining us for today's webinar hosted by Cosvox. My name is Noah Barnett and I run marketing here at Cosvox. And I'm so excited about today's webinar training because we have a special one. Typically, I'm the one presenting, but I am not an expert on storytelling. So when we went out and tried to find who is really the thought leader on storytelling for nonprofits, and how can we bring them on board to really share how you can use stories or leverage stories to not only increase your awareness of what your organization is doing and connect with a new audience, but also to raise more money for your cause. And that expert and one of our good friends here at Cosvox is Vanessa Chase Lokshin. She's the president of the Storytelling Nonprofit, and she's just an expert and continues to be a thought leader on how fundraisers like us can really use stories in our fundraising, in our communications, on our websites, at events, at different mediums to really kind of resonate and connect with an audience, but also inspire that audience to give more towards our cause and to get involved. We're so grateful to have her, and she'll be joining us in just a minute. Just to give those context to those that don't know who Cosvox is, we're an online fundraising platform that really provides you everything you need to raise money in today's connected economy. We provide both a online fundraising platform, but also training resources and hands-on help. So trainings like this are part of how we believe that we can help fundraisers around the country and around the world really do more good and raise more money for their causes. And so that's really what we're dedicated to doing here at Cosvox. We have a cool fundraising platform that really helps you amplify your reach. Everything from building donation pages, fundraising sites, doing peer-to-peer fundraising, peer-to-peer events like walks and runs. We package all of this together and track your supporters for you in our fundraising CRM, and then provide you insights and metrics so you have visibility in a real time to what you're doing and how you're raising money. And ultimately, we believe that together you can raise more, and so that you need to build communities around your cause. And that's how you're going to be able to move your impact forward. And a big part of raising more together, or to building a community of supporters that are coming together in support of the cause or the change that you're trying to make in the world, is storytelling. And storytelling is so important because we're living in a connected economy where differentiation between causes or what causes you should support have more heavily depend on what other people share about your organization rather than what you just share about your organization. And a huge part of how you equip people to share about your cause is by telling stories. And telling stories helps you really invite people to be a part of the change that you're doing and not merely give to it. So we're excited to have Vanessa to kind of help us navigate from like frustrated fundraiser to skyrocketing fundraiser. And so we're excited to have Vanessa joining us today to really provide us some practical insights on how we can just really effectively raise more money for our causes. Vanessa, thanks for joining us for today's training.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Noah. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm so delighted so many of you are joining us live for this training.
Absolutely. It looks like there's people from all over the place. So they're all here for you. So I'll let you kind of jump in and take over, Vanessa.
Yeah, I'm just going to share my slides here with all of you so you can see them. Great. So hopefully that's up on the screen now. So I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm so glad that Noah mentioned this concept of community building, information sharing, kind of this networked idea of how we're working in fundraising these days. I think it's a really important and interesting change that we're seeing in the industry and how nonprofits are fundraising and building communities, and I think ultimately really like building movements around their cause. And I say movement and use that word, I think, really in an interesting way, because that's not just a word for political causes and political campaigns. I really do think that that's something that all types of organizations can latch onto as a way to build momentum and build support in what they do. So I'm really excited today to talk about how to tell stories that resonate and raise money for your nonprofits. We're going to get into that here in a couple of minutes. As Noah mentioned, my name is Vanessa Chase Lokshin. I've worked with nonprofits for a number of years now on fundraising and communications. I'm also the author of a book called The Storytelling Nonprofit, a practical guide to telling stories that raise money and awareness that you can find over on Amazon. And you might have seen me out and about. I speak quite frequently at conferences, associations, and all kinds of trainings around North America. I've had the pleasure of working with a lot of really amazing clients over the years, Barnard College, BC Children's Hospital, Girl Scouts, Meals on Wheels, just to name a few. And one of the things that I see in common, no matter what organizations I work with, whether they're large, multi-million dollar national organizations or a small local charity, is that they all are striving to figure out how to connect with people. That's a common problem I think a lot of us are trying to solve in our fundraising, is how can we make this more kind of like sticky and resonant so that people respond to what it is we're doing. And for me, I find this a really fascinating question to be thinking about and to be helping organizations solve. And that's hopefully what I can share here with you today on this webinar. And before we dive in, I wanted to ask you a question. This is, I think, a really interesting question. I'm really curious to see some of your answers in the chat box. So my question for you is, when you think of storytelling that kind of like pulls on heartstrings, quote unquote, what comes to mind for you? So you can let me know, and I'm just going to pull up some of your answers so I can look at those as those come in. Here we go. All right. Yeah, Jasmine said it's effective. Sarah, you said emotion. Kate, people-oriented stories, especially with drastic changes. Yeah, I think that's a common one sometimes with nonprofits, where we feel like it has to be this like really dramatic story of change in order for it to be effective. Yeah, Melissa shows things have changed. Lori showing the human side. Definitely, I think there's this element of humanity that has to come into our storytelling. I see a couple of you said relatability, which is great. It's interesting. I think about relatability in terms of empathy and the kind of empathetic connection that we can create with people through our stories, but I think that's really great. Karen, yeah, all stories have conflict in them, definitely. And I always say that conflict is what drives fundraising action. It's part of what helps donors understand how they can make a difference. So it's definitely an important part. Great. So I'm really glad so many of you shared these things. Definitely some common threads and common themes to some of your answers, which is terrific. It's really interesting. When I ask people oftentimes this question about, what do you think of when you think of like good storytelling, quote unquote, or like storytelling that pulls on heartstrings, people will often tell me that they think their stories have to be like really dramatic or super sad or really upbeat. Like there's a couple of, I would say like common tropes or like common stereotypes around storytelling of what it means to be effective and pull on people's heartstrings. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about in our sector, because the problem with this is that on some level, I think it sticks us in a particular storytelling box, which is not effective for all organizations. Not all organizations are able to tell a super dramatic story, and not all audiences will respond to a super dramatic story. And I think that in a lot of ways, nonprofit storytelling has become this kind of like formulaic thing that we tell people, like, here's how you do it, here's exactly how to tell a really good story. But I think that there's a lot of nuances to every organization and to every audience. And it's really important for us to think about, how do we account for those, and how do we tell a story that works for our audience, not for some other nonprofit's audience where this type of story worked for them. And I would say even kind of like more broadly than just storytelling, this is like a question that I ask all the time about all kinds of strategy and fundraising is, does this actually work for this organization and not just for that one over there? It's a really useful question to be asking ourselves. But the thing that I think is really important to recognize is that when we get stuck in like a particular storytelling box or a particular way that we have to tell stories this way, I think it really prevents us from valuing our storytelling strengths as an organization so that we can really tell authentic and connecting stories that make sense for our nonprofit and our audience. And that's what I want to talk a little bit more about today is kind of how can we get out of this box a little bit more and tell stories that are really authentic and resonant with our audiences. So hopefully that sounds good to you. There's so many things I could say about this, but one of the things that I want to mention as we kind of move forward here too is that, We talk about in fundraising that, relationships are really the foundation of so much of our fundraising work. It's a really important piece of the puzzle. And if you think about it, the way that relationships are built in fundraising is that we really rely on kind of this common ground, right? We have to find something in common with our audience, that they probably care about your cause, they like the mission, maybe they have some values in common with you. And I think it's really valuable to think about, like, what is that foundation of the relationship and how can storytelling support that relationship building work and support us really resonating with that audience in a really like essential and kind of fundamental way. So when I think about how relationships are built, these are some of the things that I think about, and maybe they'll resonate with you as things that you think about when you build relationships with donors, whether it's through direct mail, crowdfunding, email fundraising, major gifts, any of these type of things. But I really think about these kind of like 5 big areas. So I think about values, which I think are so, so important right now. People are really aligning themselves with their values these days. And I'm not just talking about political values, but all kinds of values that they have in their life. And being able to really live out their values through philanthropy is a really important thing that I think we're seeing people do in a lot of levels in society right now. There's also this idea of shared experience. And sometimes for donors, this is a hard one to create, but if they've come to an event or something like that, maybe you've had like a big, charitable event or giving event, that's a kind of shared experience that donors have had with your organization. And that's something that your relationship could be built on. There's also things like worldviews and beliefs, which I think are similar to values, but a little different in that I think in particular for beliefs and worldviews, your organization has a vision for the future that's connected to its mission. You have this idea of what's possible or what could be different for your community, your region, or maybe even globally, depending on the kind of work that you do. And sometimes that's a really powerful message for donors to be able to connect into and to share with your organization. And the last thing that I would just say as well is, also emotional experience. This is another way that we connect and kind of find that common ground. And I think this is a really interesting one that we can kind of cultivate through stories, because sometimes people don't have to have had the identical experience that you communicate in that story to understand the experience. Maybe they've experienced it in a completely different area of their life, but they understand the emotion or the struggle or some aspect of that story that helps them be like, oh, I get it. And you've probably experienced that as well with maybe stories you've read or things that you've seen online, where you're able to kind of plug into that a little bit more. So all of these things are, I think, really important pillars that relationships get built on, but they're also aspects that we can really cultivate through the stories that we tell and hopefully be really resonant with our audience at this really deep, fundamental level. And I say that because I think so much of what can happen, especially online, can be very like surface level in terms of how we build relationships with people. And so what I want to encourage you to do is think about, how can you go a layer deeper? How can you be more intentional, be more authentic, be more connected with the people that you want to connect with in your nonprofit's community? So just to kind of bottom line all of this, but it's really about being able to find something that we have in common. And anytime I work on storytelling work for organizations, this is something that I'm always trying to figure out when I talk to stakeholders, donors, staff, volunteers, whomever I might be talking to. One of the key things that I'm trying to figure out is, what is the thread that connects all of these people together? And there always is something. And sometimes it takes a little bit of work to find that thing. But I think when you can touch on that and figure out what is it that connects all the people in our community, that's when you really hit on something magical that can be really powerful in your fundraising work. So as I was mentioning, stories are tools for being able to communicate these elements and build connection. And I think that in telling great stories to our audiences, we're really able to show them what we have in common. And I think that's a really powerful thing to be able to do these days, to be able to show people that there's some common ground, that, we're in this together kind of thing. There's that kind of sense of camaraderie and community. And, not all stories are created equally. And sometimes it takes a certain type of story or a certain way of telling stories to be able to really communicate this well and communicate this efficiently. So we'll talk about some examples of that. But I just want to highlight that for you that, there's this way in which being able to use stories as a tool for building this connection is extremely powerful and reinforces that common connection that we have with our audience that hopefully gets them to really feel like they're a part of this community and really builds that loyalty over many years and many fundraising campaigns, hopefully. So what does all this mean though? Going back to this idea I talked about earlier of being in like a certain storytelling box. Well, I think that all of this means is that we have to really find ways to tell stories that are authentic to our organization and also to our audience's experience. And this is a really hard thing sometimes for us to do. Sometimes this means that we really have to be kind of contradictory or kind of go right when everyone else is going left. And really think about what does it look like for our organization to really cultivate this common connection that we have with our audience through this story, this particular story, or maybe a series of stories that we might be telling. And I think in some ways this could be some of the biggest challenge in our work because sometimes it will call on us to really do things differently. And I think in an industry where there's a lot of talk about best practices or how to specifically do something, if we're trying something different, doing something a little like non-normative or off the beaten path, it can feel really edgy and really experimental for our organizations. But I want to say that that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's good sometimes to be in this area of discomfort, especially if you're moving more and more towards trying to figure out what works for your organization. I think this is a really highly valuable place to be in and a really good place to be doing some experimentation in your storytelling to figure out what does resonate for your audience and what can work for your organization that may not look like every other nonprofit story, but may be really effective at helping you achieve the goals that you have. So I want to ask you a question, and feel free to reply in the chat box if you'd like. I'd love for you to think about, can you think of an instance when you came across a story that really captured your experience and really resonated with you? I can think of lots of stories that have done this for me over the years. But I would love for you to just share, has there been one that really captured an experience or an emotion or really kind of got to some of these very fundamental things that we've talked about, like values or beliefs or worldviews? And maybe it's even one that your organization has shared. Maybe it's something a little different. Maybe it's from another organization or another storytelling organization. So I'll just see who has shared things. Yeah, Melissa. So again, not a nonprofit story, but definitely a compelling story. When the orca mother was carrying her dead calf for nearly 2 weeks. Yeah, that was last summer. I remember that. That was an extremely compelling and very interesting story. Great, Lori. So one of your women learned to sew through Red Tent in jail, and she's now a seamstress living a good life. Great, good examples. Yeah. And I always encourage fundraisers and storytellers to really think about your own experiences with stories, because they'll really help point you in the direction of what could work or what this experience can be like for the audience when it goes really well. Sometimes it's hard to think about can this story really make a difference? Could it really resonate with someone or be something that they remember a year from now or 2 years from now? And I think all we have to do is look at our own experiences and realize that there's lots of stories we encounter that we remember for many, many years. And there's a reason for that, right? So all right, let me just move us forward here. All right. So I want to talk about kind of a framework for telling stories that pull on the right heartstrings and really resonate with audiences. And this is a framework that I use in my storytelling work. And so I want to walk you through it and give you some examples and kind of just unpack how I think about this and how I approach some of this storytelling work for our clients. So this is the framework that I think about when I work on stories. I think about these three pieces: thinking, feeling, and doing. And I think these are really important pieces to think about, because the thinking piece is really about this kind of top level logical layer of what's going on, what are the facts, what is the audience thinking. But then we want to move into what are those facts, or what is that logical level causing people to feel? What is the emotion that's there? And what can that feeling do to translate into action? Like, what kind of action can that motivate? And ideally, in our case, it's probably getting them to donate, or maybe it's something else, signing up for, a walkathon or event or a peer-to-peer fundraiser. But being able to identify, I think, these three parts and being able to translate this into a story is where we're really able to capture the three parts of someone's experience and being able to really mirror that for them in a way that is hopefully deeply resonant. So I want to talk about these three and give you some examples and walk you through what this can look like in action. So as I mentioned, this first piece, the thinking piece, I think about this in a couple ways, which is one, what do you want people to think? Or conversely, what are people thinking about blank? So it might be the kind of issue area that you're working on, might be an issue in the community, whatever that might be. What are people actually thinking? And this is an area where you can be, I would say a little bit more of like an investigator and put on like an investigator hat and think about getting to know your audience more so that you can really understand what are they thinking about this issue or this cause or whatever it is that we're working on. I worked for an organization in Vancouver years and years ago that worked a lot on poverty reduction in a particular area of town. And it was so valuable for me as a fundraiser when I was talking to donors on the phone to just understand, like, what were they thinking about poverty reduction in this area? What were they thinking about the homelessness issue in this particular area of town? And to really understand, like, what was going through their heads that led to them making this donation. And that could be informed by, news that they're reading, conversations they're having with people. So many things can factor what people think about a particular issue. But the more you know this and the more information you can gather about this, I think the smarter it will make you as a fundraiser and also a marketer on some level. So I'm going to give you an example of this. So I thought I would pick a land conservation group, something that, might be like a not obvious organization for great storytelling. Or I think so a lot of people would think. Land conservation is a hard issue to explain sometimes. It's got a particular pull. Some people are really into it, some people are not. So I've worked with a couple of land conservation groups. And so I pulled some examples from this just to give you an idea of what this can look like. So in talking with audiences from one particular group, these were some of the things that we found out people were thinking when we talked to them and ran surveys. So we found out that they felt like urban development was negatively impacting their community. That was something that across the board, a lot of people echoed to us in conversations. People also told us that local animal species need access to underdeveloped land in the area. So habitat protection was something that they were thinking about and they were concerned about. And that they were also thinking about, the next generation should get to enjoy nature. Like, it shouldn't be so developed that there's no green space for kids and their kids to be able to enjoy these parts of the community and the local landscape. So these are some themes that kind of came through in conversations that we had with people that were really valuable. And there's, as I said, so many ways you can kind of go about collecting this information, whether it's, just listening to online conversations that people are having, talking to people directly from your community, running surveys. All of these are really great ways to gather this information and that can inform other parts of your storytelling strategy. So my question for you is, what are people thinking about the issues your organization works on? And if any of you have thoughts on this now and would like to share, feel free to. I would love to hear what kinds of things you think people are thinking about. I would also encourage you to think about the assumptions you have about what people think, and think about, like, offhand, if you had to create a list of what people might be thinking about, what are your assumptions? And then being able to go out and test those through conversations and data and whatnot, to find out if your assumptions are actually correct about what people are thinking. So feel free to send me a message in the chat box if you would like to share this. I'm just going to open this. All right. Great. Yeah, I'll give folks a second here if you want to type something in. I think this piece about assumptions is really interesting. It's something I always encourage people to examine anytime they're doing work with any kind of external audience, is to think about what kind of assumptions you have about them, their behavior, their thinking, and really question, like, do we actually have data that supports these assumptions as like good assumptions that we're making? Or are they just bad assumptions that we're working off that maybe are not actually helpful for us? Yeah, Mark. So people think that animal control is on their side to protect them and their animals. The first step has to be to educate them that animal control is actually not on their side. Great. Yeah, that's a really good example. Laura, yes, you work with refugees. People are wondering who they are, if and why they need to be in the US, and if they're here legally, etc. Great. Lots of good examples. Glad you all are thinking about some of these things. Karen, so people think donating bone marrow is major surgery and you have to give stem cells to, so I lost that one. No, where did it go? Give stem cells like giving platelets. Great. Okay, great examples. I love this. Great. So I would encourage you all to just like keep a list, keep thinking about these things, because I think that's a really helpful exercise to do. And we'll lead in nicely to the next piece that we're going to talk about, which is the feeling piece. So what feeling can prompt people to do something? Or also, how are people feeling about blank? So based on what they're thinking, what are the feelings that are coming up? And sometimes it'll be really obvious. Sometimes it'll be things like, people feel like really angry or outraged about this thing that's happening in the community, or they're feeling really optimistic about this thing that's going on, or they're feeling confused, or maybe they're feeling scared. Like there's so many different things that people could be feeling as a result of what they're thinking about in their day-to-day lives. And so it's really valuable to think about this piece and to really identify the feeling in a nuanced way. And I say that because I think so often one of the traps that we fall into with storytelling is thinking that the only options for feelings that we can communicate are either like the feeling of happy or the feeling of sad, which is a very black and white kind of uncreative way of thinking about stories. There are so many other emotions that we can communicate in our stories, and so many emotions that our audience could be feeling that we can incorporate into those stories. And I want to just give you an example of that in a way that I think about it. So this comes out of a psychology model. It's Plutchik's Wheel of Emotions. I like having this, and I had this on my desk for years to remind me of just the variety and the gradations of emotions that people feel. There's so many different emotions and combinations of emotions that come up in our lives. And it's really helpful to be able to like identify what those are over time and to be able to incorporate those into our communications, into our messaging, and into our fundraising. So I just wanted to share this with you, just to remind you that there are lots and lots of options for the types of emotions that you could be communicating, that people could be feeling. And I hope that this inspires you to think a little bit more outside the emotional box and try to figure out like, what is like the nuanced emotion people are feeling about this, and how can we really capture that in our stories and mirror that and be with people in that experience, because that's really important, being able to be with them in that experience. And I would think if you think about like any really successful fundraising that's happened in the last couple of years, like I would think about like the ACLU, for instance. Like there's reasons why that's been so successful. The ACLU has been there right at an opportune time, at a time when people are feeling a certain thing and they're looking for an outlet for that feeling. And that kind of combination, that trifecta, is exactly what we're talking about here in the thinking, feeling, and doing piece of this. So going back to our example of the land conservation group, I just wanted to kind of go through these three kind of thinking pieces that I gave you and just kind of identify like the different emotions that people might be feeling in these situations. So I think the first big one was that they could be feeling annoyed about urban development in their area. That's something that was just irritating them. They didn't like it. They didn't feel like there's a lot they could do. It's kind of like feeling of frustration. The thinking about local animal species and needing to protect them, there's a sense of like righteousness, like a principled stance that this is something good that we should be doing, and why aren't we doing it? And we should be doing something about it now. And then the last piece, which I think was really interesting, was this kind of piece around the next generation being able to enjoy nature, is kind of the feelings of sadness or fear that were coming up. Or also I'd say like feelings of like the unknown, which I kind of come into that idea of fear, like not sure how this is going to turn out and like being worried or feeling a little anxious about that. So I thought this would be interesting to show you, just to kind of point out like the variety of feelings and emotions that could come up as as we kind of dive into the types of stories that we can tell and the ways that we can connect with these audiences. All right, so what I would encourage you to do, and I know many of you listed great examples in the chat box a couple of minutes ago about pieces that people are thinking about related to your work. I would encourage you to dive in now and just think about, like, what are people feeling in relation to some of these things that you listed. And so if you wrote it down on a piece of paper, you can just write it down next to that and give yourself an opportunity to just think about, like, what are the feelings and the emotions that we can communicate and bring into those stories based on what people are thinking about. So this is, I think, a really important piece, which is that our goal in telling stories is to find this, like, magical overlap of thinking and feeling. This is a really important piece because so often I think it's really easy to just be in the logical space of information sharing, of communications and fundraising, where we're just making a case based on numbers, statistics, and all of that, which is kind of the thinking, logical part. It's also easy to just be driven by emotion and to not have enough of the thinking to really build a solid case for why something needs funding or why someone should participate in our work. So I just wanted to kind of remind you that we want to find a balance of this. We want to find the overlap of these things to bring them into the stories that we're telling. So just to talk about, like, possible stories that we could tell and kind of bring these pieces together a little bit more. So I wanted to give you some examples. So under the second example here, so local animal species need access to underdeveloped land in the area, or undeveloped land. It could be a story about a local species that is being impacted by development, whose habitat maybe is being destroyed, or maybe on the converse side, it's about a local species that's habitat has been able to be restored and brought back into the local area. And the last one here, so the next generation should get to enjoy nature, a story about a donor who gives because of their kids. I think this is a really interesting example because that is going to be a super values-driven story about a donor who values something specific. So this idea of nature and access to green space, and they're giving for a very specific reason. They're giving because they're motivated by this idea of responsibility and I'd say on some level, like, accountability to the next generation, to their kids. And so that could be a really powerful story for this group to tell. There's lots of examples. I just wanted to give you a couple here just to kind of give you this idea of what this could look like and how this could work out for your organization. So what I would encourage you to do is just think about, like, can you think of a story for your organization that captures that overlap of thinking and feeling? Can you find that really great mix of those things that capture what people are thinking about and also how they're feeling about it, that can really mirror that experience for your audience and build community and find that common ground, as we've been talking about here today? All right, so I don't have the doing piece in here, and I want to just say that's because I know a lot of you are really good at it. This is just essentially the piece about asking and calling people into action. And so this is about just creating a really good call to action. I didn't want to go into that here today because I know that that's part that many of you are really good at. I did want to give you some other tips, though, before we wrap up and go to questions. And just to talk about some general tips that I have for you this year as I think about storytelling work and things that I think might be helpful for you as you build out more strategy in your storytelling work this year. So the first tip I would offer you is to really look for opportunities to connect your story to the bigger picture. I think this is a really valuable thing that I'm seeing more organizations doing, but I would love to see even more do this year, which is to get out of the vacuum of your own organization and to think about, how does your work connect to these bigger conversations that are happening in your community, in your region, in your state, nationally, globally, and be able to contextualize it for people. I think this is what's making storytelling especially effective for a lot of the clients that I'm working with these days, is being able to provide really good context for helping people understand why something matters and why it matters now. And being able to connect this to other opportunities is really important. So being able to look at, like, the news cycle or, kind of pop culture, things that are happening more broadly that make sense, that naturally kind of connect to your organization and its work, and being able to connect to those pieces is really valuable. I've worked with one organization here locally that every year when the provincial budget comes out in British Columbia, they look for an opportunity to comment on aspects of the budget that relate to their organization's work, their nonprofit housing society. And so that makes sense for them. They want to comment on the provincial government's commitment to low-income housing and nonprofit housing for people. And so it's a really great opportunity. Lots of people are talking about the budget. It's in news stories, so it's kind of top of mind for people. And then they're able to come in with their own opinion and their own angle on this and kind of tell a story and build a narrative around that. So in feeding into that, forming opinions about things is really valuable because opinions help your audience understand your organization. I see a lot of organizations shy away from wanting to have opinions about things because they don't want to polarize their audience. They don't want to lose email subscribers, anything like that. And I actually think that that's a really unstrategic move because having opinions and taking a stance on things is actually what will bring more people into your organization's community and what will help them feel even more connected to your organization and what it is you do. So being able to really have opinions that make sense for your organization, its work, and the audience that you have is really valuable. And I think it takes your organization from, maybe being a little vanilla to, I don't know, being a much more like interesting, memorable flavor, so to speak. All right. And the last thing I would just share with you is that I would encourage you to take imperfect action more often and to learn from it. I think a lot of times in fundraising, we have this tendency to overcomplicate things and think that it's going to take us a really long time to execute something or to try a new strategy or to tell stories, whatever that might be. And one of the things that I think is really valuable is to figure out lightweight ways to try new things that you can experiment with, take imperfect action on the first time, and just to learn from it. Because I think the more you can do this, the more you can become strategic in what you're doing and to learn from, I would say, like real in the trenches work that you've tried out, as opposed to just like hypothetically, this is how we think something is going to go. So being able to do this more often, I think is a really valuable thing. And especially in storytelling, there's this opportunity to experiment and learn from what we do and hopefully continue to get better at it based on what we learn over time. All right, so before we go to questions, I just wanted to let you know I put together some story planning worksheets for you. So if you'd like to download those, you're more than welcome to. I'll just put this link here in the chat box for all of you. They're just a couple 2-page worksheet that you can grab online if you'd like to, just to help you plan out your stories and think about how it is you want to put together these great stories and connect with your audience. All right, so with that, I think we'll go to questions, Noah.
Awesome, Vanessa. Thank you so much for kind of giving a brief overview, but an extremely practical set of tools that our audience can really use, starting tomorrow. I've even learned something as we've kind of dug through this and how we even tell stories here at CauseVox, because this framework is really, really practical, regardless of kind of the cause or purpose your organization is really getting after. So thank you so much for making it extremely practical. And I hope our audience was able to get that down as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope this was helpful for everyone.
So on that note, like Vanessa said, we'd love to kind of hear your questions. So as Vanessa was sharing this story and this framework, many of you kind of shared different stories or different versions. Some of you even shared challenges that you feel are kind of obstacles to telling good stories or even engaging an audience further. And so what we'd love to do is kind of take time to dig into those questions further now. So if you have questions for Vanessa, feel free to drop those in the chat pane or the questions pane, and we'd be happy to kind of dig into those for the next few minutes. While those questions are rolling in, I just want to reiterate a few things. One thing is Vanessa did share that link in the chat where you can pick up her planning story framework worksheet. We'll also email out that link to you as well. So if you can't grab that worksheet right now, we'll definitely send that over to you after the fact as well. Additionally, we're going to be sharing the recording of this presentation so that if you miss something or you want to go back and revisit some of the pieces of the framework that Vanessa shared, you're going to be welcome to do that or even use it as a dialogue piece for for your team internally as you all are thinking about your next fundraising appeal, or how you can just really use storytelling in a variety of contexts. I think that's the great thing about stories, is as you create stories, you can actually use them in different channels throughout your communications plan and your fundraising strategy. So it looks like we have a few questions that come in. So what I'll do is I'll kind of take a look at these questions, and then we can share that. And if there's any coloring I can do as well, I'll kind of share some of that as well. So
yeah, sounds great.
Kate shares, hey Kate, thanks for sharing. She says, do you have suggestions for a strategy for experimenting with storytelling styles? I'd love to try new things out, but not in a haphazard way without a plan. And I know you mentioned a little bit about this in your tips, but what's some advice you have for Kate?
Yeah, this is a great question. I love running small experiments to see how things go in marketing and in fundraising. So one of the things I would suggest is actually starting by creating a spreadsheet and being able to list out like the kinds of experiments you want to run and how you want to execute them. Like, do you want to just test different styles of storytelling on one specific platform? Or are you going to test on multiple platforms or channels to see how your audience responds to those things? And be able to really identify like what kind of markers of success are you looking for? Like, are you looking for types of engagement, donation, upticks, anything like that? And give yourself kind of a framework for being able to track those things, I think is really helpful. But you can start small. I have a client who recently has been doing some testing around messaging on Facebook. And so they've really just focused in on testing different types of stories and messaging there. And as they kind of grow that and get a little bit more successful at pinpointing what has worked, they're bringing that over to some of their other social channels.
Yeah, I think that's a great point too, is kind of testing those small different ways, but making sure you tie it back. I know when I spent time in a nonprofit, the biggest thing was we would try experiments, and then the question would come down is like, what did we learn? And it was like, oh, or how does this relate to our objectives? And so you definitely want to make sure that any experiments you're doing align with what you're trying to accomplish in your organization and being clear about that up front. So that's great advice. I think the other thing too that you mentioned, which is key, is that different types of storytelling styles might work in different channels. So you might be doing like an offline event where you're telling stories, or maybe it's social media. And so I think even experimenting in specific channels is going to be really helpful as well.
Definitely. That's a good point.
So Lori, thank you for sharing your question as well. I think many probably have this question because it comes up a lot when we talk about storytelling. And she asks, how long should each story be?
I get that question a lot too.
We always want rules.
Yeah,
We always want like, what is the benchmark? Yeah.
I feel like this is a hard thing to benchmark, to be honest, because it really does vary from channel to channel. And I think even from audience to audience. And I'll give you a really extreme example of this. I've worked with 2 nonprofits that have very robust email programs where they're doing a lot of email-based fundraising. And one of them has been highly successful with sending long-form emails. And I'm talking about like 1,500 to 2,000 words. Like, they're very in-depth. They're very driven by theories of change about the news cycle and about things that are going on. And that works extremely well for them. I have another client who sends emails that are probably like around 500 to 600 words. And if they ever sent something that long, I highly doubt it would work for them. And so I think it's a really good, very like high contrasting example of what that can look like. I mean, in general, I would say though, I look at like, what have we trained our audience to expect in the past? Like, that's one question that I always ask. And if we did something that highly varies from what they've come to expect from us on Facebook or Instagram or in direct mail or on a website landing page, how could that impact our results? And, sometimes it's a risk we take. We try something new and maybe it works or maybe it doesn't. But I think that that's a really valuable question to ask yourself and to look kind of at creating your own benchmarks for how this can go. So I feel like that's my non-answer to this question. Noah, do you have any thoughts?
No, I think that's kind of how I'd approached it as well. Like we get questions a lot, on a variety of different, whether it's, how long should a story be, or how long should my Instagram post be, or how long should my
Right.
email piece goes? And it really just always depends on the
Mhm.
and so I think making sure you look at kind of what you've historically done and the results that you've had is super key. But also, if you've always sent short emails, trying that long email and being strategic about it in an experiment could be really interesting as well, just so that you can get results.
Definitely.
Because I think the pattern sometimes on the flip side is falling too much into the same old rut and never kind of breaking mold or creating almost like false sense of rules for what should be or shouldn't be. And I think
Yes.
sometimes it's good to be contrarian just for the sake of seeing how almost our implicit bias and what we think is always what's right we kind of step away from that. So look to yourself, but also be willing to kind of go the opposite extreme to see if there's any new lessons you might learn. But at the end of the day, it's all about experimentation. So Rich, I believe his name is Rich, shared, my executive director hates to reflect a negative image. However, we work with victims of domestic violence, so many of the stories we initially hear are negative. I'm of the opinion that some of the difficult aspects of the situations we encounter need to be used to engage the emotions of our donor base. Any thoughts on how negative is too negative?
That's a really interesting question. I think a lot of organizations face something similar where they're working with what I would say is like a really heavy cause area that, has a lot of emotion to it, that can bring up a lot of feelings, and that can really kind of like hone in on certain emotions. I've worked with a rape crisis center in the past for many, many years. And that was a challenge we had as well, was figuring out what types of stories do we want to tell and how do we want to position these to our audience. And one of the things we spent a lot of time doing was really kind of creating some internal guidelines for ourselves about how we wanted to fundraise and how we wanted to tell stories about our work. And there were a couple of really important things that emerged out of that process for us. I think one was that, we didn't want to sugarcoat what people had been through. Like we wanted to be real, we wanted to be honest. And we wanted to really bring those experiences and give voice to those experiences. And so that was a really key principle that came through for that organization. The second thing that I think was really valuable for that organization, and might be helpful for you, Rich, was that we really wanted to help let me say that again. We really wanted to make sure that our stories had this kind of angle of forward-looking vision. Like it wasn't just about like this one terrible thing that happened to someone who came to the organization for help, but that they were getting help, they were moving forward with their lives, and that they were feeling, in a lot of cases, like this thread of hope, like that their life could be different, they could feel better, that they could move forward into like this new era of their life after having been sexually assaulted. And I think that was one way that we kind of balanced like this terrible thing that they went through with the fact that, with their experience with the organization and, counseling that they went through, they were able to kind of feel, even if it was a really small like piece of optimism in their life, and being able to bring that in was something that was really important. And I would say in other ways beyond just telling stories about their clients, that was something that was really important to us. Like we wanted to find a way to balance like this kind of the realities of the situation, but also that as an organization, we felt optimistic that things could change, that they could get better for people we helped, that maybe they would get better for society as a whole. And so I think in looking at like a spread of communications over like a quarter or a year or what have you, one of the things I think we tried to be really mindful of was making sure that there was a balance of those things, that we were able to really figure out like, if we told a couple of these types of stories in a row, like, could we tell other types of stories after this? Or do we want to intersperse these more so that we're really mixing the messages a little bit more and giving people, kind of this balance of these two tones and these two kind of conflicting, but also like important things that we feel about the issue, and being able to bring that to the audience. it was a tough balance. And I'd say it took a while for, for all of us to figure that out. But it was really a really helpful exercise for the organization to kind of really build out their voice and really figure out their messaging and positioning over time.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I think what you said is so important, is just kind of having that conversation internally. And Rich, one of the things I would kind of like when I first saw your comment is, I think like my executive director hates to reflect a negative image. Sounds like a great opportunity to kind of like unpack that further and like, well, what does it mean by negative image? Like, how does that relate to our cause? Because I think giving more definition to this idea of negative image, that's kind of vague and abstract. And so kind of being able to tease that out and say, well, what does that actually look like for our organization? Similar to what Vanessa said, is going to be extremely important, because what you say, negative image, might be different from what they're thinking. And you don't want it to be unintentional limiting factor into kind of how you're able to tell and share your organization's stories.
Definitely.
So we're going to end on one question. I think it's an important question, and so I wanted to get kind of your thoughts on it. It's more of a medium question. But I think as we look at the world that we're living in today, there's increased use of video and also kind of increased consumption of video. So Claire asks, how can I most effectively use videos as a medium for telling my organization's stories? Or is there any nuances that you might kind of point out as people look to step into video storytelling, maybe for the first time, or kind of a renewed focus based on current trends?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I have to say, video is not my strength as a consultant and as a storyteller. I do think it's a really interesting medium that I'm excited to see organizations be using more of. And I think that one of the great benefits of all of the ways that social media has incorporated and rolled out video is that I think it's really lowered the barriers to production for organizations to participate in video.
Absolutely.
And I think that that's really valuable. So I think for me, when I've seen clients dabble in video, I think one of the biggest things that they've had to get over is perfectionism and feeling like they need to have certain equipment, or, you know, they have to like spend hours scripting something. You know, I think so much of particular social video is about documentation and not necessarily like production quality. And so just getting in a very different mindset to create those kinds of videos, I think, has been helpful for some of them. But I know, Noah, you all do a lot more with video than I do. So I'm curious to hear your tips on this.
Yeah, I wish I had some more concrete things. I think we promote video a lot and see a lot of success, especially on our platform, when people use video well. And I think what you hit on was that well doesn't mean $30,000 or like top of the line equipment or like movie style production value. It can mean different things to different people. I think what I've seen, and I think even in this case, they were talking about like end of year videos or conference highlights, or, to kind of share at an event, is that there's a push because of social and because of our interaction with that to be just like more honest and real and almost like less polished, because it brings a humanity and kind of a personalization into that. I think there's definitely still a case to have like really polished videos and kind of invest in that depending on budget and also kind of like what you're looking to do or the medium that you're sharing that video in. I think there's a great opportunity to kind of maintain a humanity or kind of a realness in the videos. Especially in the work that we do, where people are kind of saying, hey, we're inviting you to be a part of this. And so even through that kind of lower quality, I guess you would use, video, it makes it more approachable to invite others to be a part of that as well. And that this is kind of like we're organizing together to make a change in our world. And so kind of the more real or human the video is over production value, I think is important. Production value is like still important. It's just kind of, I would prioritize real human, kind of maintaining kind of the integrity of the mission and kind of the cause over production first style. I think it can get away from you both on budget and kind of like end result. If you kind of push too much into this world of video where you're like, hey, let's craft this big video and all of this and hire a video guy and like do all of these things, you can kind of lose some of the kind of integrity of what the video's intent was and get too caught up into like perfection and not actually drive results.
That's a great point.
So video should still maintain that, like you shared, Vanessa, like that think, feel, doing, and knowing that typically in fundraising, videos are to kind of still drive some sort of action is really important, because I think there's a lot of videos I've seen that are beautiful and great, but that's it. Like it was like, that was awesome.
Yes.
Like it's not persuasive. It's not, pushing towards people. So it's like, how do you do conversion video making where you're like, hey, we're trying to drive someone to do something. And so again, that's the more important thing, especially when it comes to fundraising.
Yeah. I think that's a really important question to ask.
Yeah. What do we want people to do after they watch this video? And then keep that top of mind regardless of, production quality and whatnot. So that's kind of our 2 cents on that. But thank you guys. Thanks everyone so much for joining us and sticking around for the questions. Vanessa, as always, your insights are great and experience driven, but also super practical and easy to kind of grab onto. We're going to be sharing a lot of the notes out after today's presentation, the recording, and also that link to grab that storytelling template. So Vanessa, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks everyone else for joining us. And we're excited to see you guys on our next webinar. We do have a panel discussion going on Thursday with 3 nonprofit leaders who are going to be sharing how they're telling stories effectively, but also just rallying people around their cause in today's connected economy. So if you're interested in that, I'll include a link in the follow-up as well so that you can join us for that live conversation with people that are in the trenches. So thanks again, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.